theft is wrong. Nobody seriously defends breaking into somebody's house and stealing a laptop or smashing a jewelry store window to nick a diamond necklace. That's just straight up crime. Things become murky, however, when what's being stolen is art, or more specifically, access to art. That is to say, creative intellectual property occupies a strange ethical territory where theft is concerned. There are, of course, cases where the theft of art is undeniably destructive. Music leaks are probably the clearest example. Take Charli XCX. In 2017, her Google Drive was hacked and unreleased songs were stolen. In the aftermath, her label shelved the project entirely, citing financial problems and a loss of creative control on Charli's behalf. What it might have once become a creative album is instead fragments scattered across the internet without Charli's consent. What was it you wanted? She's hardly the first artist to experience this kind of violation. In 1969, stolen recordings by Bob Dylan were pressed and circulated as a bootleg album, Great White Wonder. 3 decades later, Metallica famously took legal action against Napster after an unreleased demo of I Disappear leaked online before its official release. Since then, leaks have become almost routine in the music industry, especially in the digital age, where unfinished songs can spread globally in a matter of minutes. And it's not just about money or privacy. Leaked materials are often unfinished, technically substandard, or artistically unrepresentative. Works that artists have deliberately chosen not to release. Take, for example, the case of Lana Del Rey. Her unreleased songs are very popular among fans, in part because of the widespread, if illicit, availability on platforms such as Spotify and SoundCloud. Despite their accessibility, however, many of these recordings are rudimentary demos, sometimes little more than voice notes, and contain lyrical content she ultimately chose to abandon. For example, 2009 demo Boarding School celebrates anorexia, and the lyrics go like this. Let's do drugs, make love with our teachers, come on, date a townie, let us tattooed ass beat ya. I'm a fan of pro-animation. I do them drugs to stop the food cravings. While these lines contribute to Lana Del Rey's mystique, functioning as clear precursors to her second album, Ultraviolence, their circulation outside of her control raises complicated issues. The fact that such material reaches wide, and often young audiences, without context, reveals the core problem of leaks. They strip artists of the ability to determine how and when this work should be heard. This issue extends beyond music and into books. Here the problem isn't so much about leaks than publication where the author is no longer alive to object to the publication. In November 1998, the New York Times announced that Ernest Hemingway's last novel, True at First Light, was to be published the following year. Already his novels, Islands in the Stream and The Garden of Eden, and a wealth of non-fiction writing, including a memoir of his years in Paris, The Moveable Feast, had been published by the Hemingway estate after his death, but in his name. This decision was met with lots of public criticism. In one letter he wrote, quote unquote, "It is my wish that none of the letters written by me during my lifetime shall be published." Readers aware of this request were outraged by the continued publication of his unfinished material. The backlash was spearheaded by the great American essayist Joan Didion, who condemned the releases as part of a systemic creation of a marketable product that, in her view, threatened to obscure the controlled prose Hemingway had published. As she so wonderfully put it, you care about the punctuation or you don't, and Hemingway did. You care about the ands and the buts or you don't, and Hemingway did. You think something isn't shaped to be published, or you don't. And Hemingway didn't. Hemingway is not alone in this ghostly afterlife. Kafka, Philip Larkin, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Emily Dickinson, Anais Nin, they all had this posthumous publications against their explicit desires. More often than not, the slow release of manuscripts does precisely what Didion identified. It complicates the carefully constructed public images these authors curated during their lifetime. To prove her point, Didion recalls a dinner party at which a professor cited Fitzgerald's posthumously published The Last Tycoon, to quote-unquote prove Fitzgerald's lack of writing talent. This problem of making works public without the author's consent gets worse when the texts in question are not fiction but private correspondence or personal records. Examples include Sylvia Plath's abridged journals and Virginia Woolf's private diaries. These exposures dissolve the boundary between the private and the public that, in life, the authors retain the right to negotiate. This anxiety runs beneath Joan Didion's New Yorker essay. Although explicitly about Hemingway's fiction, much of it concerns the quote-unquote peculiarity of being a writer and the mortal humiliation of seeing one's own words in print. In this, Didion implicates her own personal archive and the state responsible for protecting the archive after her death. This concern became reality last year when Fourth Estate published Notes to Joan, a 208-page text of journal entries Didion wrote to her husband, John Gregory Dunn. These entries record conversations in her psychiatric sessions, recollections of childhood, confessions of alcoholism and depression, and her uneasy relationship with motherhood. Didion's most private thoughts, prejudices, and desires are exposed for public consumption without her consent. Despite these ethical concerns, however, there is a compelling argument in favor of posthumous publications. If authors alone had a final say over whether or not their work survived their death, significant works of literature would simply not exist. Without Max Broad's intervention, we would not have Franz Kafka's The Trial or the Castle. Without Dmitri Nabokov, there would be no The Original of Laura. Without Lavinia Dickinson, most of Emily Dickinson's poetry would have been lost altogether. What looks from one angle like a violation can, from another, appear as preservation. Furthermore, critics have long relied on letters and diaries to interpret literary texts. Psychoanalytic readings of Sylvia Plath's diaries or queer readings of Virginia Woolf are often grounded in biographical material that would not exist without posthumous publication. If these materials possess genuine cultural or academic value, how do we justify denying their release? Where exactly is the line between preservation and intrusion, and who gets to draw it? These questions are complicated by a rather more prosaic question. Why didn't the authors simply burn their own works themselves? This is especially true in the case of Joan Didion, who died almost at the age of 90. She must have known she was near the end of her life, and yet she preserved all her own writings. And perhaps this is due to an atavistic, deeply human impulse to deny one's own death. Or maybe it's nostalgia, or perhaps it's trust in the executors of the estate. We don't know. We can't answer that question. The complexities of these issues have long been explored in other works of art. The 1981 cult classic, the movie Diva, for instance, centers on an unauthorized recording of an opera singer who refuses to allow her performances to be commercially reproduced. More recently, these questions were fictionalized in R.F. Kuang's bestseller, Yellowface, which follows a character called June Hayward, a struggling writer who steals the unfinished manuscript from her deceased friend, finishes it, and then gets it published under her own name and thereby finds literary success. The character June repeatedly justifies her actions by insisting that the story itself deserves to exist as it recounts an unexplored point of colonial exploitation. So June recasts her appropriation as advocacy. But bad faith underpins her logic. June's defense of the manuscript is inseparable from her own professional jealousy and hunger for literary recognition, which she had failed to attain with her own writing. Her supposed loyalty to her friend and to the story itself functions less as an ethic than as a convenient alibi for personal ambition, opportunism disguised as reverence. Yellowface is useful because it clarifies the stakes, which is the ethics of posthumous publication cannot be resolved in the abstract, but depends on questions of motive. It helps to look at a real-life true example. Let's take a look at the case of Margaret Suckley, otherwise known as Daisy Suckley. Margaret Lynch Suckley was a sixth cousin, close friend, and confidant of U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. As a man in a wheelchair, no one considered Roosevelt as a lover. Public perceptions of their relationship shifted dramatically in 1991 when Daisy's diaries and letters between Roosevelt and herself were discovered and published. While the material is not scandalous, it is, nonetheless, deeply intimate, and it was clear that there had been a sexual relationship between the two of them. It is difficult not to view this publication as a form of violation. Intimate life is transformed into historical material and, inevitably, into something marketable. In 2023, Justine Gilbert published Daisy Chain, a fictionalized retelling of the relationship from Daisy's perspective. Crucially, Justine Gilbert writes not as an editor or historian, but as a relative, and the shift in tone is immediate. Where the non-fiction publication of the letters is presented as an archive, as something to be examined, Daisy Chain reframes their relationship as fiction. The characters are treated with respect and developed as fully realized individuals. Simultaneously, the fictive framing signals that the portrayal is necessarily speculative and imagined, meaning no real reputations are directly at risk. This distinction matters. However loosely fictionalized, Gilbert's version feels more attentive to the questions of voice and interiority, less concerned with revealing than with restoring a sense of agency to its subjects. It does not resolve the ethical tension, but it does gesture towards a different model, one in which posthumous material is reworked with care, proximity, and imaginative responsibility. Ultimately, this is the standard of care a posthumous publication must meet if it is to be considered ethical. In the process, it canonizes the creator into a work of art.